What if one of the biggest physical changes to the White House in decades was not funded by Congress, not openly financed by taxpayers, but instead built through a donor network that included major corporations, billionaire power players, and contributors with enormous business before the federal government? And what if some of those donors were allowed to stay anonymous? That is the question now hanging over Donald Trump's massive White House ballroom project, a plan tied to the demolition and overhaul of the East Wing, backed by hundreds of millions of dollars in private money, and surrounded by growing accusations of secrecy, conflicts of interest, and political favoritism. Because this is not just a story about architecture. It is not just a story about renovations, donor dinners, or flashy legacy projects. It is a story about power, who gets access to it, who pays to get close to it, and what happens when the lines between public office and private fundraising start to blur. According to reporting from the Washington Post, CBS News, the New York Times, and watchdog group Public Citizen, the donor system behind the ballroom project shielded identities for those who wanted anonymity, gave only narrow conflict of interest scrutiny, and emerged publicly only after a lawsuit forced key documents into the open. And the deeper reporters looked, the more one pattern kept appearing. Donors were not random admirers of presidential design. Many were companies or individuals with contracts, investigations, regulatory stakes, merger approvals, lobbying agendas, or broader industries deeply affected by decisions coming out of Washington. Tonight, we're breaking down what the articles reveal, why this story matters far beyond one building, and why this could become one of the clearest case studies yet in how modern political fundraising, executive power, and elite influence are colliding in real time. Let's start with the project. Trump's White House ballroom plan is not some minor refurbishment. It is described as one of the most significant alterations to the White House complex in decades. Reports place the cost in the $300 million to $400 million range, with Trump publicly saying the administration had raised around $300 million and at other times more than $350 million, while CBS reported the full renovation was treated as a $400 million overhaul. The project involved the East Wing and surrounding modernization, including office space, a movie theater, kitchen space, a two-story colonnade, and support infrastructure, with demolition crews beginning work in October 2025. That alone would make this a huge political story. But what transformed it into something bigger was not just the scale of the project, it was the funding mechanism. Instead of a standard, fully transparent appropriations process, the ballroom was financed through private contributions routed through the Trust for the National Mall, working with the National Park Service and the White House. According to CBS, a 14-page agreement signed in October 2025 empowered the trust to accept enough donations to cover the entire project, with the White House itself identifying potential donors and telling the trust whether a donor wanted to remain anonymous. And this is where the story begins to change. Because once private donors are financing a sitting president's signature White House project, while many of those same donors have billions of dollars in federal interests, the issue is no longer whether the ballroom looks beautiful. The issue becomes whether the system itself invites influence, favoritism, and secrecy. One of the most explosive parts of the reporting is that the governing contract itself was not simply released to the public as a matter of course. According to the Washington Post and CBS News, the agreement became public only after watchdog group Public Citizen sued under the Freedom of Information Act, and a judge ordered its disclosure. The Post reported that the contract shielded donor identities, excluded the White House from key conflict of interest protections, and had been kept secret even as work was already moving ahead. That matters because secrecy changes the public's ability to judge whether influence is being bought. If the donors are hidden, then Congress, journalists, watchdogs, and the public cannot easily compare a donation with a contract award, a dropped enforcement action, a favorable merger review, a pardon, a policy carve-out, or a regulatory retreat. That is exactly why critics say anonymity is not some neutral courtesy here. It is the core of the controversy. CBS reported that the agreement explicitly required the parties to preserve the anonymity and privacy of any donor who wished to remain anonymous. The White House, under that arrangement, was responsible for identifying potential donors on behalf of the National Park Service and indicating whether they wanted anonymity. Foreign donors were prohibited, and donations above $25,000 were subject to some vetting tied to the Interior Department and National Park Service. But the articles note that nothing in the contract stopped donations from companies with major business before other parts of the federal government. That's a crucial point. The conflict screening was narrow. Critics argue the real power center was much broader. According to the Washington Post, the contract's review process focused on the Park Service and Interior Department while making no clear provision for the president, White House officials, or the many federal departments whose actions could affect donors. In other words, a corporation could be seeking a contract, lobbying for favorable rules, trying to avoid penalties, or pursuing merger approval somewhere else in the executive branch, and still donate to the president's showcase project. That is the structural issue at the center of this story. Now let's move to the donor universe itself, because this is where the story becomes less abstract and more concrete. The publicly identified donor list included major corporate names like Amazon, Lockheed Martin, Palantir, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Apple, Coinbase, Comcast, Nvidia, and T-Mobile, alongside billionaire families, foundations, and politically connected individuals. Public Citizen said the White House released a list of 36 ballroom donors, including 21 corporations and 15 individuals or family foundations, while CBS identified at least several more corporate donors. These are not symbolic contributors. Many of them sit at the heart of America's defense, technology, media, crypto, telecom, energy, and manufacturing sectors. Many of them depend on Washington in one form or another, through procurement, regulation, antitrust enforcement, tax policy, trade policy, export controls, telecommunications approvals, labor rulings, or merger decisions. Public Citizen's analysis found that 16 out of 24 corporate donors had received government contracts, totaling roughly $279 billion over 5 years, including nearly $43 billion in the last year alone. The single biggest name in that dataset was Lockheed Martin, which the report said received $191 billion in contracts over 5 years. Booz Allen Hamilton came next with $79.6 billion, followed by major sums tied to Microsoft, Palantir, Amazon, Comcast, Google, T-Mobile, and others. That number, $279 billion, is important because it tells you the scale of what was already at stake before anyone wrote a ballroom check. This wasn't a donor class standing outside the machinery of government. These were actors deeply embedded inside it. But the Ballroom Project is only one piece of the broader ecosystem. The New York Times investigation expanded the story far beyond the White House renovation and traced nearly $2 billion raised after Trump's return to power for his favored political causes and projects. The Times identified 346 major donors who each gave at least $250,000 and reported that more than half had benefited or belonged to industries that benefited from actions or statements by Trump, the White House, or federal agencies. That is what turns this from a niche White House controversy into a major current affairs story. Because if the ballroom were the only example, defenders could say it was simply philanthropy for a presidential legacy project. But the Times describes a much larger post-election money apparatus. Trump's inaugural committee raising nearly $240 million. MAGA Incorporated taking in roughly $200 million between November 2024 and June 2025, and the Ballroom Project itself raising hundreds of millions more. Among the donations the Times highlighted were Palantir's $10 million to the Ballroom and $5 million to America 250, Lockheed Martin's $10 million to the Ballroom and $5 million to America 250, Meta's $2.5 million to the Ballroom, plus $1 million to the inauguration, and Google's agreement to donate roughly $22 million to the Ballroom. Those are extraordinary sums. And the article says the identities behind much of the larger cash flows were not legally required to be fully public, with the Times also reporting that Trump's team offered anonymity to some ballroom donors. So when you zoom out, the ballroom looks less like an isolated fundraising event and more like one visible node in a much bigger influence network. This is the most sensitive part of the story, so we need to be precise. The reporting does not prove that donations directly caused specific policy outcomes. The New York Times explicitly says it is not possible to prove that any individual donation directly led to favorable treatment. The White House and agencies also reject the idea that donors were getting special treatment. But what the reporting does show is a striking pattern of overlap. According to the Times, donors or their industries benefited in multiple ways. Pardons, ambassadorships, regulatory relief, dropped or softened enforcement, government access, and potentially lucrative contracts. At least 32 donors who gave $250,000 or more were tapped for ambassadorships or high-level positions. The article also points to defense contractors lining up for opportunities around projects like Trump's proposed Golden Dome missile defense system, with firms such as Lockheed Martin and Boeing expected to compete for major work after large inaugural donations. Palantir is another key example. The Times and Common Dreams note that Palantir secured federal contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, including work tied to immigration enforcement technology, while also being one of the major contributors to Trump-linked causes and the Ballroom Project. In crypto, the Times reports that companies such as Coinbase, Kraken, Ripple, and Robinhood donated at major levels and later saw the SEC retreat from a harder-line approach, even as the industry benefited from pro-crypto legislation and friendlier regulation. Public Citizen similarly highlighted victories for Coinbase, Ripple, and the Winklevoss orbit as the administration took a more favorable stance. Public Citizen also flagged examples outside crypto. It said the Trump administration withdrew an FDA plan to ban menthol cigarettes, a move benefiting Altria and Reynolds American. It pointed to T-Mobile, whose merger investigation was closed by the DOJ, while also noting T-Mobile's tie to Trump Mobile. It highlighted Union Pacific, whose proposed $85 billion merger with Norfolk Southern remained under scrutiny after Trump fired a board member who had opposed the deal. It cited Extremity Care, whose pricing controversy drew Trump's public attention and was followed by a CMS delay in a rule that would have hit the company's Medicare pricing. Again, the important point is not to claim every one of these is proof of corruption. The important point is that the overlap is so extensive that it keeps generating the same question. Why should companies with so much at stake be privately financing a sitting president's personal legacy project in the first place? To be fair, the administration and associated organizations do offer a clear defense. The White House has argued that private funding means taxpayers are not footing the bill for the ballroom. Officials have described Trump's effort as part of a broader beautification of the White House and defended the project as historically significant and fully financed without taxpayer expense on the above-ground construction side. CBS also reported that the Trust for the National Mall said it discloses donor names in annual reports, on its website, and in tax filings, while respecting donor wishes for anonymity in compliance with applicable laws. The trust emphasized that it was not involved in the planning, design, construction, or execution of the ballroom itself, only the donations side. The White House's broader answer is basically this. These are generous American companies and individuals supporting the people's house. Critics would complain whether the project was publicly funded or privately funded, and there is no evidence that donations bought special treatment. That defense matters, and any serious analysis has to include it, but it does not erase the underlying perception problem. In politics, appearance matters almost as much as proof. And when the donor list includes firms with billion-dollar government relationships, public skepticism becomes inevitable. So what is the real takeaway from all this? It is not simply that Trump wanted a ballroom. Presidents care about legacy. They always have. It is not even that wealthy donors gave money. Wealthy donors have long shaped American politics. So here is the question I want to leave you with. If donor transparency is important enough to demand from universities receiving foreign money, shouldn't it also be mandatory when wealthy political allies and giant corporations are funding a sitting president's White House legacy project? And if some of the people paying for that project are also seeking contracts, regulatory relief, or influence across the federal system, where exactly is the line between philanthropy and power politics? That debate is now out in the open because the documents are out, the donor network is being mapped, and the contradictions are getting harder to ignore.